Nation. Appreciate you streaming in here on Birds 365 with the Mac and Mac guys, John McMullen and Jody McDonald on this now less than 2-week Tuesday to when the Birds return to the field in the semifinals. They get to take a week off that everybody else is working hard. Well, at least the other 12 teams that are in the playoffs and not the Kansas City Chiefs, but you get my drift. The bye week is a big thing for the Philadelphia Eagles, but we've got to come up with storylines and topics to run by you guys before we ever find out who the Eagles will be playing after this weekend's playoff action. Johnny Mac, I think yesterday I asked you about Nick Sirianni. You said not going to be available, pushing his usual Monday appearance to Tuesday this week. They've got flexibility because they are the number one seed in the NFC. Anything you're looking forward to out of Sirianni today? You think he got any curveballs to throw you, or going to be standard Nick operation?
No, standard issue, standard Nick Sirianni experience today. Understandably so. It's they're in a good position. They're exactly where they wanted to be. Now, maybe at the end of the season didn't unfold the way people liked, but as Nick will quickly remind you, you don't get extra wins for style points. So they got where they needed to go. The Super Bowl goes through Lincoln Financial Field. They're getting healthier at a right time. C.J. Gardner-Johnson being back. That's a big get back. Lane Johnson expected back for the playoffs. Jalen Hurts expected to be healthier for the playoffs. So, it's all positive from the head coach's perspective. And I think he's right, to be honest. I think, I was thinking about it. I kind of stepped back, Jody, and the NFL, I think a lot of its popularity is fueled by the time in between games, because that's why we exist here, right? Everybody gets so in the weeds. You're a baseball guy. Now, managers get second guessed all the time, but guess what? There's a game the next day usually, and people move on and turn the page to the next day. In the NBA, might be a couple days, but they turn the page pretty quickly. There's constant looking and over-analysis and paralysis by over-analysis. And now it's even picked up further because they have a bye week. So we're going to go through all this, and it's fun and it's all that. But this is the best team in the NFC by a wide margin. It has been for the entire year. I went through the PFF rankings. They grade 13 categories, so it's final. I believe, 12 of those 13 categories, they're in the top half of the NFL, top half. 9 of those 13, they're top 10. They're the number one overall team. Basically, from start to finish, Kansas City was very close, but they were the number one overall team. I mean, and the NFC side, Jody, man, it's never been easier. Never been easier when you look at it from the perspective of the quarterbacks and the potential roads. And I always say you can talk yourself into things in the NFL because everybody has good players. Everybody has good players. This is not TCU versus Georgia. You're not going to see that kind of mismatch in the NFL. Even if you want to go all the way down to Chicago, people will talk that, they've the number one overall pick. They're the worst team. Or if you want to go to Houston, which Lovie Smith screwed their ability to get Bryce Young. They all have good players. So you can talk yourself into a lot of stuff, but the Eagles have more good players. So they're in a good position. They're in a very good position.
They are in a good position. San Francisco's the only team that's scaring me at all in the upcoming NFC East playoffs. You mentioned the Bears and the Texans because the Eagles got to play both of those teams this year. Played them both on the road. Played them both in games that might have been a little bit closer than Eagle Nation felt comfortable with. But, of course, they won both games, seeing as they went 14-3. They weren't losing to a team of that magnitude. I think it ended up, like you said, end of the season, you can do some final calculations, PFF's grades for the overall season. Well, one of them that you can do is strength of schedule, because strength of schedule varies. as we go through the season, it was like, oh, they're undefeated because they haven't played anybody. Well, that wasn't true. It was overstated for sure, and it wasn't exactly true. But they finished up the season. Eagles played the 23rd toughest schedule out of the 32 teams in the National Football League, which is not tough because they had the Bears and Texans, and the schedule falls the way it falls. Well, one of the things that happens at the end of the season, and we can do that here on Birds 365 because if we were one of the 12 teams that are going to be playing this week, we'd be narrow focused on the opposition for the big game coming up over the weekend. We can't do that with the Eagles because we don't know who the Eagles are going to play. So we can take a look at something like the schedule next year. As soon as the season's over and done with, you're playing the following season. The only thing you don't know are the dates that those games are going to be played because it's a schedule that they put into a formula, and immediately who you're going to be playing. Have you seen the Eagles schedule, J-Mac, for next year for 2023?
Yeah, I got a bunch of oh, look at how difficult it is.
It is.
Yeah, I got a bunch of that. Yeah, I don't buy into that for this reason, Jody. I mean, how many teams are in the playoff? The NFL sends this out every single year, right? How many playoff teams were not in the previous season's playoffs? Every single year.
Right, there's a turnover.
It's 2020. It goes all the way back to 1990. But in recent years, we'll go back, 2017 when the Eagles won the Super Bowl. And by the way, they weren't in the playoffs the year prior. 8 teams were not in the playoffs in 2016, but were in the playoffs in 2017. 2018, 7 teams. 2019 was the worst year, only 5. 2020, 7. 2021, 7. 2022, 7. So, everybody assumes because you're good one year, you're going to be good the next. Now, there are teams like Kansas City with a consistent standard of they're going to be good. The head coach is a big part of it. The quarterback is even more of a big part of it, to be honest. You have that consistent standard. They're going to be good. There are a few teams like that. Man, there is so much upheaval in this league from season to season. If whomever gets Bryce Young, if Bryce Young turns out to be a star right away, you could have Chicago or Houston in the playoffs. That's how drastic it could be. That's how quick it could be in this league. So, yeah, I got like 10 Twitter. Oh, my God, how difficult it is. First of all, me, I'm saying, hey, how about focusing on a 14-win team that's going to make a run potentially to the Super Bowl? Worry about that a little bit later. But the second part is, I guarantee you the number is going to be that we can put the floor at 5, but it's probably going to be 7 because it's been 7 the last 3 years, the last 3 seasons. That's how many different teams are going to be in the playoffs. So you can look at the easy team and say, oh, we're going to – it's not that way in the NFL.
Understood, but I think it's worth noting. You're right. You need to reanalyze. This isn't because you look at the teams today and you see that 11 out of their 17 games next year are against teams that made the playoff this year. I certainly think that's worth noting. The fact that they have the number one strength of schedule on paper going into next year is worth noting. And then you readjust as the season's ongoing. You go, all right, these weren't as good as we thought. Damn, like a team like the Rams. They only have 2 games out of the 17 where they're facing a team that was worse than 7-10. The Jets were 7-10. They finished last in their division, but they were not all that far below 500. The only 2 games they got against teams that were well below 500 were the Rams and the Cardinals. Now, who knows? Maybe the Rams, Stafford stays healthy. The coach decides to stick around and they get it turned around next year. They're only 1 year removed from being a Super Bowl winning team. So even the teams that look like lesser lights on the schedule could jump up. It goes both ways. Both teams that you think are going to be good don't achieve, and teams that you think, all right, well, they're buried. They stunk this year. They can jump up and become very good. I'm just noting that on paper, it looks like a very tough
Well,
schedule.
but we could do it analytically. Alec Halaby, I'll give him a hat tip. There's 14 playoff teams, right? So there's 7 new ones the last 3 seasons. So that means 50%. What did you say? 11? 50% of that 11, you can't get to 50. So 5.5 of those teams aren't going to be in the playoffs. Hopefully, that's not the Eagles. That's what you got to be concerned about, the consistent standard of being a good football team. I think the Eagles are set up to be a good football team for a while because they have a good head coach and they have a good young quarterback. But that's what you got to worry about. And we're in hiring season now. So there's 5 teams looking for head coaches. 60% of them already asked to interview Shane Steichen. Already the rumors are fueling in Houston about John Gannon. There are a lot of things that can go south. And when you start to lose good coaches, that's going to affect you. There's a lot of things. The Eagles are in that category as well. There are going to be 50% of the teams in the playoffs this weekend, starting this weekend, that aren't going to be in the playoffs next season. And if I were an Eagles fan, that would be my concern, to make sure the Eagles have that consistent standard. If they play like they did this year, they're going to win 12, 13, 14 games again.
Right. It's I'm not even going there, but I just thought it was of note that we should take a peek at the schedule that they have next year. Because you're right, and there are teams that made the playoffs this year won't next year. Like I said, St. Louis, the Rams, they didn't make the playoffs this year, but who knows? Maybe they jump right back up and they become a 12-win team again next year. So while you lose teams, you also have the potential of adding teams. And the Eagles, of the teams that are on their schedule this year, they've got the best record of winning percentage from this season going forward to next. And that's what happens when you finish in first place, because 3 of your games are determined by where you finish. So you're playing other first place teams. In this case, for the Eagles, it added Minnesota and Kansas City, a 13-win team and a 14-win team. Yeah, that's the price you pay for winning a division like the Eagles did this year. All right. You brought up the already requests going out for Eagles coordinators for the only 5, as of right now, only 5 coaching openings, which, again, in compared to previous years, is a little on the light side. Usually it's 7. Sometimes it's getting up to 8 on a really turnover year. It can get even as high as 10. On a lesser year, it'll be down around 4 or 5, and it's a 5 right now, which means as of now, it's a lesser year. But remember, it was only a couple of years ago that the Philadelphia Eagles decided to change their coach. They didn't do so till a week after Black Monday. Yesterday, everybody gets fired around the NFL. Well, the Texans beat the bunch by firing Lovie Smith on Sunday night, and we already had a couple of job openings. Teams really beat the Christmas rush and fired guys in season. So Black Monday didn't turn out to be all that black, except in Arizona. But the desire to talk to Eagles coordinators has already begun. Jonathan Gannon, Shane Steichen, both to the Texans. 2 more teams reached out for Shane Steichen's availability. And, I told you here yesterday, hot take of the day, I think Shane Steichen could get the Texans job over Jonathan Gannon for one reason and one reason only, John. It's an offensive league. And
yeah, well, I say it all the time. I mean, defensive coaches have a extra hurdle because most of the teams are going to be looking for an offensive coach. And that's why you have Shane getting, 60% of the teams. And so far, Jonathan's only gotten 1 request. It was pretty amazing. He got 3 requests last year. He interviewed with Houston, Denver, and Minnesota. Now he had a history with Minnesota, so you can understand that. When he had a history with Denver from the perspective that the ex-assistant general manager in Minnesota went to Denver. So that's how these things happen. Sort of, you have these relationships and people want to talk to you and relationships are everything in this league. And that's why I think, if Jonathan's going to get a job, it's Houston, because he's got a tremendous relationship with the GM there, which is Cleveland based. And that's why I think he's such, and Aaron Wilson, who's about as plugged in down there as anybody. Well, I always say John McClain, our buddy on the show, is even more so. But Aaron's very plugged in as well. He speculated on Gannon right away. That tells you a lot. And again, it's got to do with the relationship of the GM. And who knows, Nick Sirianni, who knows how much power he has down there. He hasn't been knocking it out of the park himself. So who knows how that will go. With Shane, Shane's a hotter guy now. And it was the opposite last year. Shane's one, because offensive, two, because of Jalen Hurts' development. And he's a big part of that. And people around the league notice it. And yeah, I mean, what helps the Eagles, about the only thing that helps the Eagles in this coaching carousel is the fact that they project to have a deep run in the playoffs. And a lot of these, usually organizations looking for coaches, usually, not all, the Eagles being a perfect example when they moved on from Doug Peterson. But most of these organizations are bad organizations. They're in the position for a reason. Some of them consistently, like Houston. And they make bad decisions and they get rushed and they feel they need to do things quickly and they jump the gun and they a lot of times you see it, the teams that go to the Super Bowl, their coordinators you would think would have the best opportunities. A lot of times they're kind of blocked out because people don't have the patience to wait. So the longer the Eagles go, it's probably the better for them to keep their coordinators, to be honest. And it happens every year in this league. And there's going to be a couple more. I think the Rams are going to be looking for a coach. I don't think Sean McVay wants any part of a rebuilding. And who knows, you might have another curveball. So, yeah, Eagles keep winning. It actually helps.
Yeah, their availability, they're going to take advantage of it this week and get their interviews in. But as far as second interviews go and potentially making the offer to one of their two coordinators to take over as head coach somewhere else, can't come quick enough. But I will, and I know this would be really difficult to look up. One of the reasons why, despite the relationships, I don't think Gannon's going to get the Houston job is, when was the last time a team in the NFL fired a defensive coach? And when I say defensive, tied to the defensive side prior to being the head coach, and then hired another defensive coach. That just doesn't happen. If a defensive coach gets fired, I'm giving you off the top of my head, 95% of the time, the next head coach is going to be an offensive guy. And that's a pretty steep number for Jonathan Gannon to get over. That's why I said I think Steichen's got a better chance at that gig. Relationships aside, you just don't go back-to-back defensive coaches. It doesn't happen in the NFL. It hasn't happened in 2 decades.
I normally, you're 100% right, Jody. There's a pendulum effect, but I would be careful with Houston for this reason. It's not a typical situation. I don't think they hired the coach they wanted to hire because they didn't have the courage to handle the criticism. Now, that could have been Jonathan Gannon. That could have been Josh McCown. It was one or the other. So they're a little bit different than the typical, we're just moving on because we screwed up and we're going to go in a different direction. Same thing with sort of disciplinarians versus player coaches. You usually have a pendulum effect with that as well. So Houston is a little bit different because they've been so screwed up for the past couple of years. They're just trying to get a leader, trying to get somebody to lead the organization. It's not the typical situation. Denver as well, because I think they're going to go with an offensive coach after hiring an offensive coach. But
offense into offense happens. Defense into defense doesn't happen in the NFL.
And Nathaniel Hackett was such a disaster. They're just going to try to erase that from history. And just try to help Russell Wilson out. So I think, I'm a little surprised they're not one of the teams that has asked to talk to Shane. I'm a little surprised by that. But
so you wanted 80% of the openings to involve Shane.
Well, everybody works off the same list. That's the joke of this league. Everybody works off the same list. But I see D Gunn. We got to get the D Gunn.
Derek Gunn, our very own, is going to join us next. Yeah, you'll hear him in a couple hours on his show which is phenomenal, by the way. But most importantly, he's going to be here with us. And he's coming up next. Derek Gunn jumping aboard Birds 365. Stick around.
Go for the beers